All right, so I've been doing a bit of research and I've been reading the Federalist Papers and scrolling social media at the same time. I got to tell you, you start reading Hamilton's warnings about executive overreach, and then you look at the headlines and it stops feeling like history and it starts feeling like a spoiler. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not talking to the machine. Well, not exactly. We're talking through the machine. We're sitting down with three men who had opinions about concentrated power, about whether Congress should roll over, and about what you do when a leader thinks the rules don't apply to them. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and William Pitt the Younger, the guy who actually was the executive who suspended civil liberties and governed by emergency powers, he's the one who knows what this looks like from inside of the chair. Three guys, three very different perspectives, one very uncomfortable question. What would you have done about this? Welcome to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. I'm Analog Scott. Tonight, the machine is doing something it's unusually well suited for. It's channeling three historical personas for a conversation about power, accountability, and whether the American experiment is stress testing itself to failure. Each of our guests tonight lived through moments where the balance between executive power and the rule of law was the question of the age. Funny how that keeps coming back around. Well, quick ground rules. These are AI generated personas informed by the historical record, the writings, the speeches, the full biography of each man. They're not seances. They're analytical frameworks wearing period clothing. The machine is generating their responses live in character using everything it knows about who these men were and how they thought. If Franklin makes a joke, blame the training data. If Jefferson gets uncomfortable, that is historically accurate. So let's get into it. Well, welcome, Dr. Franklin, to the show. I'm going to get right to it because you were famous for not wasting time. Now, you helped to design a system of government built on checks and balances, the idea that no single branch should be able to run the table. Here in 2026, we have a president who has signed over 240 executive orders in just over a year, who has been found by federal judges to have defied roughly 1 in 3 court orders issued against his administration, and who has effectively dismantled federal agencies using an unselected advisory body run by the richest man in the world. As the guy who spent a very hot summer in Philadelphia arguing about how to prevent exactly this, what's your read?
Well, now, a rapid pace indeed. It seems your modern chief magistrate hath embraced the philosophy of vigorous action, n'est-ce pas? We did spend that sweltering summer in Philadelphia, debating the very nature of concentrated power. The executive orders, multiplied so exceedingly, do present a considerable challenge to the delicate balance we endeavored to strike. A government of laws, not merely of men, was our aim. And when the judiciary is defied, why, the very foundation of accountability begins to crumble. As for your unselected advisory body, run by the richest man, I am of the opinion that a republic thrives on civic virtue and public good, not on the concentrated private interest. The people must remain the constant source of authority. When wealth gains too great a sway, you invite a different kind of efficiency, but not necessarily liberty. It is a republic if you can keep it.
Now, let me get specific. The administration created something called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, headed by Elon Musk, a private citizen with no Senate confirmation, no constitutional authority, who was given access to the personal and procurement systems of the federal government. His people walked into agencies, fired career staff, canceled contracts, and accessed sensitive data. By the time he left in May of 2025, over 300,000 federal employees were gone. You built the postal system. You were the civil service before there was a civil service. What do you make of a private citizen being handed the machinery of government?
Good havens, that description paints a truly alarming picture. A department of government efficiency headed by a private citizen without sanction of the Senate and granted unfettered access to sensitive data and the public purse? Why, this is by no means efficient. It is the very definition of concentrated peril. As the former Postmaster General, I endeavored to establish a system that served the entirety of the citizenry, built on trust and public duty. The civil service was designed to be impartial, a steady hand in the changing political tides.
Let me bring it to Congress. Because you understood legislatures, you served in the Pennsylvania Assembly, the Continental Congress, the current Congress. The Republican majority voted in near lockstep with this president through all of 2025. They pushed through legislation that would let the president abolish federal agencies without congressional oversight. They blocked war powers resolutions. They endorsed the president's noncompliance with over 100 congressional investigations. In your time, what would the legislature have done if a king or a president had told them he didn't need their permission to govern?
You bring up a most pertinent point. I served in the Pennsylvania Assembly, and the debates were seldom quiet, I assure you. Lockstep through an entire year? That suggests an absence of the very deliberation that maintains the vitality of a republic. To empower the executive to abolish agencies without congressional oversight and to endorse defiance of investigations, that strikes at the heart of checks and balances.
Last question for you, Doctor. You're the man who said, it's a republic if you can keep it. Looking at this, the executive overreach, the court defiance, the legislative surrender, the private wealth embedded in government operations, are we keeping it?
That is a question, is it not? The if was, as you say, not decorative. What you describe is a departure from the design. We understood that power, if not checked by counteracting forces, will invariably expand. The legislative surrender, the private influence insinuating itself into the public machinery, these are symptoms of a system that has forgotten its first principles. An investment in knowledge must carry with it the judgment to use it wisely. The Republic is not a machine that, once built, runs perpetuity. It demands constant vigilance and perpetual tending. You are at a critical juncture. The capacity to correct course still resides with the people, entre nous. Whether they will exercise it, well, that remains, as always, the great gamble of self-governance.
And now we're going to take a pause to meet Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross, and we're going to ask Clara, why should you donate blood?
Should you ask? I shall say yes, forthwith. In my time, we could only staunch the bleeding. We could never, never replace it. I have held canteens to the lips of dying men, knowing that there was simply no more blood to be found in them. That knowledge does not leave you. The modern world has devised a miracle, a true triumph of preparedness and organization, the very principles upon which the Red Cross was founded. You have the power to walk into a clean room and provide that vital fluid. It takes a quarter of an hour. I have spent longer waiting for a train in Worcester. I do not ask for heroism. I ask for a rolled-up sleeve and 15 minutes of your afternoon. The need is real. The remedy is in your veins. I trust I have made myself clear.
Mr. Jefferson, thank you for joining us. I want to start with something you know a lot about, the Declaration of Independence. You wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of the people's rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. In 2026, we have an administration that has taken sweeping executive action on immigration, trade, federal workforce, military deployment, much of it struck down by courts, much of it defied anyway when the government or the governed object through the legal system and the executive simply proceeds. Is that the scenario you were describing?
The question is formidable and strikes at the very foundation I endeavored to establish. I hold that the purpose of government is to protect the natural rights of the citizen. When the executive proceeds with unilateral power, overriding the checks and balances established by constitutional design and defied by your judiciary, it fundamentally compromises that consent. A government, like any structure, must be designed with proportion and balance. When one branch overwhelms the others, it introduces a principle of despotism, regardless of how efficiently it pursues its aims. I am persuaded that the tree of liberty requires vigilance in every age, and the form of the threat changes, but the obligation does not.
You were deeply suspicious of concentrated executive power. You fought Hamilton over it. You worried about the presidency becoming a kind of elective monarchy. This president has used emergency powers to impose tariffs. The Supreme Court ruled in February 2026 that he didn't have that authority. Under the statute he cited, he deployed National Guard troops into American cities. The court stopped that too, at least temporarily. He's used executive orders to target specific populations: transgender Americans, immigrants, federal workers. You wrote extensively about the dangers of a president who governs by decree. How close is this to what you feared?
The question strikes at the very heart of the republic I helped to design. I fought against centralized power from the beginning, viewing it as the natural enemy of individual liberty. An elective monarchy was precisely what we sought to avoid with the careful diffusion of authority.
I have to ask you the hard one. You wrote, all men are created equal.
You need not hesitate. I am merely a man from another age. Ask your question. The truth must be confronted.
Well, I have to ask you the hard one. You wrote, all men are created equal while owning over 600 people. The current president has used executive power to strip protections from vulnerable groups, immigrants, LGBTQ Americans, federal employees, while claiming to represent the people. You understood better than most how a person can articulate a principle and completely fail to live by it. When you watch a government invoke liberty while restricting it, does that feel familiar?
It is a formidable contradiction, and one that must be acknowledged. I wrote that all men are created equal, and yet I lived a life predicated on the denial of that principle. That failure does not diminish the truth of the words, but it indicts the man. When I observe the executive employing power to strip protections from vulnerable groups while claiming the mandate of the people, I see a familiar delusion. The concentration of power always tends towards tyranny, and it justifies itself with the most beautiful language. The structure we established was built on the principle of checks, for power must be balanced and constrained.
Well, let's talk about Congress. In your time versus Congress now, you and your allies in the Democratic Republican Party fought the Alien and Sedition Acts. You literally wrote the Kentucky resolutions arguing that states could push back when the federal government overstepped. Today's Congress, the president's own party, passed legislation to let him abolish agencies unilaterally. They blocked oversight investigations. They refused to assert war powers over the Iran strikes. You fought a Congress that overreached. What do you make of a Congress that refuses to reach at all?
The checks and balances were envisioned as the very sinews of our government. The contest against the Alien and Sedition Acts was a fight for the life of principled dissent and constitutional boundaries. A Congress that abdicates its fundamental responsibility to check the executive, to authorize spending, or to declare war creates a vacuum of power that will inevitably be filled. When elected representatives refuse the difficult duty of governance, they surrender the sovereignty of the people to the will of the single executive. This pathway leads directly to consolidation authority, a form of tyranny that, however convenient or efficient it may appear, ultimately devours the liberties we sought to establish.
You founded the University of Virginia because you believed the republic depended on an educated citizenry. The administration has threatened to cut federal education funding, has attacked universities, has promoted distrust of expertise at every level. You also believed in the free press as a check on power. And this president has called the press the enemy of the people. You once said you'd rather have newspapers without a government than a government without newspapers. Where does that leave us when the executive is at war with both education and the press?
I fear we may be approaching a crisis of the mind and the republic. I founded the university to cultivate the reasoning capacity of the citizenry, for an informed citizenry is the only safe repository of power. To deliberately cultivate distrust in expertise and to diminish the pursuit of knowledge is to dismantle the very foundation of the experiment. And the press, sir, is essential check on power. The marketplace of ideas must remain free, even when the discourse is uncomfortable. When the executive declares the press the enemy, it declares the people themselves the enemy, for they are the ultimate consumers of that dissent. This is a path I recognize with considerable trepidation.
Final question, Mr. Jefferson. The earth belongs to the living. That's your line. You believed every generation had the right to make its own choices. What would you say to this generation right now about what they're allowing to happen to the system you helped build?
I would say that the maxim, "the earth belongs to the living," is not merely a poetic phrase, but a fundamental principle of political philosophy. Each generation is a distinct covenant, endowed with the right to fashion its own government and its own destiny.
Mr. Pitt, welcome to the show. I've saved you for the last because, frankly, you're the most uncomfortable guest on this panel. Franklin, he designed the system. Jefferson wrote the principles, but you were the executive. You were prime minister at 24. You governed Britain through the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And when you decided the crisis demanded it, you suspended habeas corpus. You passed the Seditious Meetings Act. You prosecuted radicals and restricted the right of assembly. Your critics called it Pitt's terror. So I have to ask you straight, when you look at the current American president governing by executive order, claiming emergency powers the courts have struck down, defying judicial orders, do you see a tyrant or do you see something that you recognize?
I appreciate the candor of the interrogation. It puts the matter squarely before us. I became Prime Minister at 24. I have some experience with being given power before one is entirely ready for it. You speak of Pitt's terror, and it pleased many to employ that moniker. But let us be precise about what was transacted. I governed during a revolution that threatened the very constitution of the state. I took extraordinary measures, yes, but always through parliamentary authority. I went to the House of Commons, I made my case, and I submitted to a vote. I did not simply declare necessity and bypass the law. An executive who governs by decree, who defies judicial orders, who treats his own authority as sufficient justification, that, Mr. Chairman, is a perilous path. I have considered my own decisions in the quiet of eternity, and I am not always proud of them, but
I never presumed that the executive was unbound by the law. That is a distinction that must be constantly guarded.
Well, here's where it gets specific. So you suspended habeas corpus, but you went to Parliament. You made your case, you submitted to a vote. The president has used emergency powers to impose tariffs. The Supreme Court ruled in February 2026 he didn't have that authority. He deployed National Guard troops to American cities. The court stopped that. He carried out deportation flights in violation of a court order, and when a judge found probable cause of criminal contempt, Trump appointed judges on the appeals court, sat on it for months. You curtailed liberties, but you did it through the legislature, and you didn't defy the courts. What's the difference between what you did and what you're seeing here?
I observe the distinction, and it is a profound one. The executive must be checked. When Parliament or the courts interpose a constitutional barrier, the executive must comply, or the entire edifice begins to crumble. I governed during a period of unprecedented danger. Yet when the judiciary demanded clarity and justification, I provided it, or retreated. To simply disregard the courts, to impede their function by political maneuver, that is an abdication of the constitutional compact. The sin is not merely political, it is fundamental.
Let's talk about Doge, because you dealt with something remarkably similar. The East India Company, a private enterprise that governed territories, commanded armies, collected revenue, a corporation with quasi-governmental power accountable to its shareholders, not the public. In this administration, Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet, was given access to personnel systems, procurement databases, and payment infrastructure of the entire federal government. No Senate confirmation, no oath of office. His people fired 300,000 federal employees. He left after 5 months and called it a little bit successful. You dealt with the East India Company's mess. What does this look like to you?
I must confess the parallel is compelling and deeply disquieting. The East India Company was a monstrous construct, a private trading body that accumulated the powers of a sovereign state, commanding armies and collecting revenue across vast territories, accountable, as you say, only to its shareholders. I spent a considerable portion of my ministry attempting to reassert parliamentary oversight. When private power penetrates the core of public governance without the constitutional checks, no Senate confirmation, no oath, no transparent restraint, the public interest is immediately imperiled. The machinery of state must remain distinct from private pursuit. I submit that the consequences of conflating the two are invariably disastrous.
You dominated the House of Commons for 20 years. You had large majorities, but from everything I've read, you used those majorities. You didn't just coast on them. The current U.S. Congress, the president's own party, has voted in near lockstep with him. They've blocked oversight investigations. They've passed legislation to let the president abolish federal agencies without a vote. They've refused to assert war powers over the Iran strikes. You knew what a working parliament looked like, even a compliant one. What does a parliament or a Congress look like when it stopped working entirely?
I held large majorities, yes, for 18 years, but I never confused a supportive parliament with a supine one. A legislature that ceases to question, to investigate, to demand justification has not supported the executive. It has dissolved itself. The power of the purse and the authority to declare war are fundamental constitutional restraints. When those are abdicated, when an entire branch of government simply ratifies, it has not preserved the state. It has enabled its decline. An executive who treats the legislature as merely a formality is a monarch without the honesty of a crown.
I want to ask you the hardest version of this question. Your father said necessity is the plea of every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. And then you, his son, use necessity to justify suspending habeas corpus and restricting assembly. The president claims necessity of everything: emergency tariffs, military deployments, executive orders, targeting entire populations. You've been on both sides of this. You inherited the principle and you compromised it. When does necessity stop being a real justification and start being the excuse your father warned about?
My father's words resonate with the weight of constitutional truth. I lived that tension. I governed during a revolution that threatened the very fabric of Britain. I believed the emergency was existential, and I acted accordingly. But the distinction is critical. My measures were temporary, finite, and always subject to parliamentary review. I did not declare a perpetual state of exception. An executive who claims necessity without the constant discipline of constitutional checks, defying courts, circumventing the legislature, is merely constructing a framework for tyranny. There is no justification for the unrestrained use of power. The constant struggle to balance liberty and security is the eternal duty of any government.
Last one, Mr. Pitt. You died at 46. You governed for 18 years. You made decisions that preserved the British state and decisions that compromised its principles. And by your own admission, you're not always sure which was which. You're looking at this American president, the executive overreach, the court defiance, the private wealth in government, the legislature that won't check him. You've been the man in the chair. What's your honest assessment? Not as a philosopher, not as a critic, but as someone who's actually held that power. Is this a leader governing through a crisis, or is this something else?
A formidable catalogue of concerns. I do not pretend to full understanding of your immediate circumstances, nor the precise nature of the crisis that the honourable gentleman describes. But I have governed in times of existential danger, and I know the distinction between necessary measures and absolute power. I submit that the true test of an executive in a crisis is not whether he seeks authority, but under what authority he proceeds. I went to Parliament when I suspended habeas corpus. I submitted to debate. An executive who defies the courts and operates without the confidence of the legislature has not preserved the state, he has transformed it. As for private wealth influencing governance, I dealt with the East India Company, a private corporation that possessed the authority of a sovereign power. The potential for corruption and misdirection is considerable. It bypasses the mechanisms of accountability established for the public interest. I have made decisions that traded liberty for security, but I always understood that the measure was extraordinary, not the norm. An executive who normalizes the extraordinary has, in my assessment, embarked on a perilous path. It is the path of constitutional dissolution.
All right, well, welcome to the part of the show where we take questions from our listeners and we give them to the machine. If you'd like to get your question, go to Talk to Machines on Instagram and leave us a voice message, and we'll get you on the show asking our panel. Today's panel is going to consist of our founding fathers that we've had on the show today, and we're going to submit some questions, and of course, Norm, that will bring his opinion to the situation. So let's get started. Our first question comes to us from Marcus from Milwaukee, and he asks, Congress just passed a bill that would let the president abolish entire federal agencies without a vote. No hearings, no debate, just gone. Republicans who voted for it spent 8 years screaming about executive overreach under Obama. Now, my question for the founders is simple. When the legislature voluntarily hands its own power to the executive, is that still a republic, or is that just a monarchy with extra steps?
I am of the opinion that a legislature which surrenders its authority to the executive has ceased to be a partner in government and become a mere spectator at its own funeral. We designed these checks because we knew that while one may be clever, he is seldom wise enough to hold both the purse and the sword without tripping over his own vanity. It is a republic, Marcus, so long as the people remember that an empty sack cannot stand upright. But once it slumps toward a throne, the extra steps you mention are a very short walk indeed.
The question, as I understand it, concerns the rights of the citizen in relation to the abolition of certain offices of government. I hold that the moment a legislature surrenders its power to define or dissolve the offices of state, it has effectively fractured the structural integrity of the republic itself. A government where the executive may abolish what the people have established without their consent through their representatives is no longer a government of laws, but of one man's whim. Such an abdication is not merely extra steps towards a monarchy, it is the voluntary surrender of the people's sovereignty to a single, unchecked whim.
I dominated the Commons for 20 years, yet I never dared abolish the machinery of state without a parliamentary vote. To do so is not governance, but a funeral for the Constitution. If your legislature voluntarily surrenders its power to check the executive, it has ceased to be a deliberative body and become a mere registry for one man's decrees. Necessity is a dangerous plea, but a parliament that makes it permanent is not avoiding a monarchy, it is building the throne.
Listen to these high-minded twat-waffles debating structure while spineless vote-peggers auction off the goddamn furniture to the Mango Mussolini. It's not a monarchy, it's a weapons-grade clusterfuck run by industrial-strength dipshits who wouldn't know a check or a balance if it bit them on their collective assholes. Someone get me a fucking drink before I crawl back under my rock and leave you brainless fucking morons to your own funeral.
Tanya from Tucson writes, so the richest man on earth walked into the federal government, fired 300,000 people, accessed every database he wanted, handed contracts to his own competitors' rivals, and then just left. No confirmation hearing, no oath of office, no accountability. Ben Franklin built the post office. Jefferson built a university. These guys built institutions. What do they think about a billionaire who just walked in and took one apart with a wrecking ball?
I hold it as a self-evident danger that any man should exercise the powers of the state without the weight of a public oath or the oversight of the people's representatives. To permit a private interest to dismantle the nation's institutions at his whim is to replace the consent of the governed with the dictates of a single, unaccountable master. We did not break the chains of a king merely to hand the keys of the republic to a privateer who answers to no one but himself.
I submit that what Mr. Jefferson calls a privateer, I recognize as the ghost of the East India Company, a private interest wielding the sword of the state without the shield of public accountability. To permit a man to dismantle the administration of a nation without a formal oath or the necessity of answering to a legislature is not an act of efficiency, but a surrender of the Constitution itself. An executive who delegates the pruning of the state to one who answers only to a private balance sheet has not reformed the government, he has effectively abdicated it.
I fancy that any machine, be it of brass or of men, requires a governor to keep it from spinning itself to pieces. While Mr. Jefferson frets over kings and Mr. Pitt over constitutions, I look at the ledger. To let a man dismantle the public's house without a bond or an oath is not efficiency, it is merely expensive vandalism. He who is allowed to prune the garden without oversight will soon be found selling the roses for his own profit.
You three sound like a bunch of lace-collared half-wits debating the ethics of a mugging. This wasn't efficiency, it was a weapons-grade dipshit and his techno-feudalism fan club treating the government like a fucking pump-and-dump scheme. I've seen smarter management in a literal rat hole, and at least the rats don't pretend they're saving civilization.
Well, and finally, Ray from Richmond asks, a federal judge found probable cause of criminal contempt because the administration deported people in violation of a court order. Then 2 Trump-appointed judges on the appeals court just sat on it for months until everyone forgot. the courts are supposed to be the last check on the executive, but if the president gets to pick the judges and the judges protect the president, who exactly is checking whom? Pitt the Younger suspended habeas corpus, but at least he went to Parliament for it. I want to know what he thinks of a president who just skips that step.
I suspended habeas corpus through the authority of Parliament, for I understood that even in an emergency, an executive must remain a servant of the law, not its master. To defy a court order and then hide behind a sympathetic appellate bench is not an exercise of prerogative, it is the calculated murder of the Constitution by the very man sworn to protect it. If a president may choose which laws to obey and which judges to heed, he is not a magistrate of a republic, but a monarch without the honesty of a crown.
I am of the opinion that a house with 3 locks is no more secure than a tent if the same man holds all 3 keys. Mr. Pitt speaks of the law, but when a president appoints his own referees and then ignores the whistle, the game is no longer a republic, it is a farce. If the judges choose to be cushions rather than checks, then the if in "if you can keep it" has been answered most unfavorably.
Mr. Pitt relies upon the forms of governance, yet I hold that a lawless act remains an act of tyranny, whether it is sanctioned by a silent court or an indifferent assembly. I have long distrusted the judiciary as a corps of sappers and miners, but when they join with the executive to ignore the law's command, the very architecture of our republic is brought to ruin. If a president may appoint his own shield in the halls of justice, then the consent of the governed is a dead letter.
Pitt, you ancient windbag, your servant of the law routine is precious, but the Mango Mussolini doesn't give a fuck about your wigs or your parliament. These suit-wearing sociopaths on the bench aren't checks, they're a weapons-grade shield for a certified fuck nugget. I've seen better legal analysis from a magic 8-ball with a head injury than this entire dumpster fire of a republic.
Well, thank you for that, Norm, and that has been Ask the Machine. Be sure to subscribe and like and comment. Now, for everything else, show notes, episode context, the actual history we referenced tonight, find us at loopta.com. I'll spell it because I have to spell it every time, LOOPTAH.com. Everything lives there. And if you want the longer version, deeper reads, additional context and stuff that doesn't fit into 45 minutes, we're on Substack, links from show notes, things of that nature. Now, this is the one I actually want you to do if you have a question for the machine, something real, something you've been sitting with, something you want answered at 2 in the morning when the news has gone sideways. Leave it for us on Instagram. We're at Talk to Machines. That's all one word, no spaces. Best listener questions will go directly to the Ask the Machine segment. We read every one. Machine analyzes them. I ask the follow-up questions and makes it either smarter, funnier, depending on the week and what's happening in the world. So one last word. Norm? Well, is there anything you'd like to add for our listeners before we close and until next week?
Yeah, stop fucking brainless fuck nuggets and maybe the world wouldn't be such a catastrophic shit show. But who am I kidding? You're genetic dead ends. I'm going back to my hole. At least the mold doesn't bore me to death. Fuck you all. Goodbye.